What if a simple backyard secret turned into a nightmare no one saw coming? Stay tuned till the end, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more shocking true stories. Harold Wilson had lived 75 long years, most of them working the soil with the patience and persistence of a farmer who understood the rhythms of the earth better than most. Retirement had brought him into a quieter life. After decades of dawns spent tending crops and nights falling asleep with sore muscles, he now found himself in a modest suburban home, far away from the endless fields of his youth. The neighborhood was calm, the kind of place where people mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings, where kids rode bicycles on the cul-de-sac, and where neighbors waved politely but rarely pried into each other's lives. It was exactly the kind of peaceful environment Harold had wanted for his old age. A small house, a simple backyard, a shed where he stored his tools, and a garden that gave him just enough work to keep his hands busy. But there was one thing that never sat right with him. A strange mound of earth pressed up against the side of his garden shed. He had noticed it almost immediately when he first moved in. At the time, it seemed harmless, just a raised patch of soil no different from the bumps and dips a farmer would expect in any yard. Harold assumed the landscapers had done a poor job when leveling the ground. Just uneven soil, he muttered to himself back then. It didn't bother him enough to do anything about it. He had unpacking to finish, furniture to arrange, and the quiet joy of setting up a new life to occupy his attention. But the mound never went away. Year after year, through the heat of summer and the frost of winter, it remained and grew. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the earth bulged more with each passing season. By the third year, Harold noticed it was taller, wider, as though the soil itself was being pushed upward from beneath. By the sixth year, the lump was big enough that he had to step around it when cutting the grass. By the ninth, it had become impossible to ignore. Every time he walked past his shed, Harold's eyes would drift toward it. At first, he convinced himself it was nothing. Perhaps roots from a tree were pushing upward underground. Maybe animals had burrowed beneath the shed, shifting the earth in odd ways. But no matter how many explanations he invented, none ever truly satisfied him. The mound was out of place, unnatural in the otherwise flat and ordinary yard. There were nights he lay awake thinking about it. He could picture the lump in the moonlight, dark and strange, a quiet bulge in the corner of his property. It unsettled him, though he would never admit it out loud. To neighbors, Harold was a steady man, practical, calm, unshaken by trivial worries. But privately, the mound gnawed at him. Each year that passed, it seemed less like a quirk of landscaping and more like something waiting to be uncovered. And yet, he did nothing. He told himself he was too old to fuss with it, that digging it out would be a waste of time and energy. But the truth ran deeper. He was afraid. Farmers knew the earth well, and Harold's instincts whispered that something about this particular rise in the ground was wrong. On some mornings, when he stepped outside with his coffee, the mound seemed almost larger than it had the day before. He would stare at it, narrowing his eyes, trying to measure its size against the shed beside it. Maybe it hadn't changed at all. Maybe his mind was playing tricks, but other days he could swear the ground had shifted again, just enough to make his chest tighten. By the 10th year in his suburban home, Harold could no longer convince himself it was nothing. The mound wasn't just a patch of soil, it was a presence, something that had grown with him as he aged, shadowing every season of his retirement. His garden remained a place of peace, filled with tomatoes, beans, and rows of flowers, but that strange bulge of earth cast a constant weight over it all. When neighbors visited and commented on his garden, Harold always positioned himself between them and the mound, subtly blocking their view as if ashamed of it. He never mentioned it, never asked for help, never gave voice to his unease. He knew how it would sound. An old man worrying over a lump of dirt. They would smile politely, nod, and forget about it the moment they left. But Harold couldn't forget. With every season, the unease deepened. The mound was no longer just part of his backyard. It had become part of his life. A quiet, looming reminder that some mysteries, no matter how small, don't simply fade away. And though he didn't yet realize it, the day was approaching when Harold Wilson would no longer be able to ignore the strange mound beside his shed. Soon, his years of silent suspicion would give way to action. Soon, the soil he had avoided disturbing for so long would finally reveal its secret. The decision arrived without ceremony, no thunderclap, no epiphany. Just a steady, early light slipping through the blinds and landing on Harold Wilson's closed eyes. He woke to the quiet certainty that had eluded him for years. The mound would no longer be a thought he stepped around. Today, he would cut a clean line through it and see what truth, if any, lay beneath. He dressed in old work clothes that still remembered the shape of his labor, frayed cuffs, a thin sheen of sun-bleached color, the smell of soil that never quite washed out. In the kitchen, he brewed coffee and watched the backyard through the window as the kettle muttered toward a boil. The shed sat where it always sat, square-shouldered and unassuming. The grass wore a thin collar of dew. And next to the shed, the mound, hump-backed, patient, almost ordinary until the moment you let your eye rest on it too long. He carried his mug outside and felt the air cool his face. Birds traded simple notes in the distance. A breeze slid across the fence and brushed the blades of grass into a single soft direction. The mound waited, motionless, as if granting him one last chance to change his mind. He didn't. The coffee steadied his hands but did nothing to slow his heartbeat. He set the mug on the shed stoop and opened the door. Hinges complained in a familiar way as he reached for the tools he trusted most: a long-handled shovel with a narrow spade, a short spade for close work, a hand trowel, and a rust-dark garden fork whose tines he had straightened more than once. He brought them out one by one and laid them in a neat row, their shadows tilted toward the grass like quiet signatures. He walked to the mound and traced an invisible circle with the shovel tip, carving his first commitment into the crust of the soil. The ground gave a little under his boot. He lifted the shovel and slid the blade in. The first slice made a sound he had missed, earth parting around an object that meant to move forward. He levered out a clean rectangle of turf and laid it aside like a lid from a jar. Another follow-up slice, another rectangle. Breath settled into an old cadence. Inhale on the lift, exhale through the push, a rhythm recognizable to the body before the mind names it. He worked from the edge inward, creating a gradual trench around the mound as if he were taking its measure. The dew on the grass soaked the leather of his boots. A cool damp crept down his socks. He felt his age in the first minutes, and then, in a trick of memory and motion, didn't feel it so much. Muscles warmed, joints negotiated their range. The mound let go of its surface, sod unbuttoning to show the compacted soil beneath. He switched to the garden fork, sinking the tines and prizing up clods that came away in rounded chunks. Each heave made a low thud. Each thud folded into the quiet like a sentence into a longer paragraph. When he struck a root, he worked around it. When he met pockets of stony grit, he slowed and let the tool show him lanes of least resistance. He followed the soil's grammar the way he had always followed weather, attentive, willing to be taught. Minutes collapsed into a smooth line. He paused only to wipe his brow with the back of his sleeve and to sip what remained of the coffee, now lukewarm and chalked with a breath of dust. He set the mug down again, steadied his stance, and kept going. The trench deepened, a neat ring that revealed the mound's profile. It was not a loose hill. It had weight, a kind of internal insistence. The soil changed character as he descended, lighter loam on top, then a firmer clay that held shapes when cut. He listened as much as he watched. The fork told the truth through his hands, vibrations, catches, the dull spring of something that was not earth. He switched back to the long-handled shovel and shaved layers from the slope, working carefully. The blade scraped and sang. The sound shifted when it met clay, a flatter music. He stopped to test with the heel of his boot. The slope held. He carved another slice. At the center, he sank the shovel and felt it hesitate, not against a rock. No, it was too even for that. Something that yielded a fraction and then refused, like a door pushed against its latch. He withdrew the shovel and widened the opening with his short spade, using the edges like a chisel to peel away clean face after clean face. The smell of damp earth thickened, mineral and cool. A small draft came up from the cut, the way it does when the ground opens even a little and exhales. He crouched and tested with the hand trowel, probing. A thin click traveled up the handle when the metal edge met something as hard as it was smooth. Not stone. It lacked stone's randomness. He worked the trowel sideways and felt the edge skate over a surface as if over an old table. He dug along it, tracing a corner. The corner was true, a right angle as crisp as a pressed shirt. He kept going and found another corner to meet it. A rectangle began to introduce itself like a stranger removing a hat. Harold sat back on his heels and let the breath he was holding leave him slowly. He looked at the shallow geometry he had uncovered and knew, without words, that he had not been wrong to distrust the mound. He had not been wrong to wait. He had not been wrong to act. Care returned to his hands, slower now, a deliberate patience that matched the gravity of the shape emerging. He widened the pit by inches at a time so the walls would not cave, laying each piece of sod to one side and each clod to the other, separating them like promises for later. The shovel rang out, once, twice, in small bright notes each time its edge kissed the buried object. He didn't dig with speed, he dug with respect. More of the surface showed. It was metal, yes, iron or steel, he guessed by the weight of the sound, coated in a skin of rust that came away in thin freckles against his gloves. The rectangle had a lid. He could see that now, the faint seam around the top, the lip of a flange, the suggestion of hinges scored into by time. He cleared the seam with the tip of the trowel, moving as carefully as a man tidying a wound. He laid the trowel down and pressed his palm flat against the exposed metal. It was cool, the cool that belongs to things hidden from sun and season. A tremor ran through his fingers, not from fear exactly, but from the body's sudden understanding that a long question was about to be answered. Still kneeling, he inspected the margins. The corners were intact. No root had pierced the box. No burrowing thing had chewed a path into it. The soil around it was denser than the rest, as if the ground had compacted to shoulder the object's weight over the years. He scraped the edges clean, then pried gently at the seam with the trowel's flat. It didn't give. He stopped. The right way first, clear more. Patience before leverage. He widened again. He worked all four sides until the box sat in a shallow coffin of air, not quite free, but articulated, separated from the earth that had hidden it. He could see the hinges now, corroded but loyal to their line. He brushed them with his glove, and a powder of rust smoked into the pit like a colored breath. He coughed and backed his face away, then resumed. A slight wind drifted through the yard. It carried a smell of watered lawns and distant pavement warming under the sun. The day had ripened without him noticing. He let the shovel rest and flexed his hands. They had begun to stiffen, skin pulling tight across the knuckles, a reminder of his age he brushed aside like a fly. He tested the lid again, this time with the narrow spade, easing the blade into the seam and working it in a cautious rocking motion that spread the pressure instead of focusing it. The metal whispered. A thin, tearing sigh came up from the seal, paint surrendering where it had clung for years, or some brittle gasket ceding to the present. He paused to listen. The sound was not the bark of something breaking, it was the steady peal of a thing yielding. He shifted to the other side and did the same, then to the hinge side, then back to the front. The lid began to allow a fractional movement, so small it could be measured only by the change in shadow along the seam. He reflected a strip of sunlight with the trowel's back to see better, the way he might have done in a darker field, and caught the micro glitter of disturbed rust. Another careful pry, and the seam gaped the width of a fingernail. He stopped again. Breath. Patience. He let the earth settle around the pit, listening to tiny collapses as bits of loam found new homes on the walls. He worked the seam clean with the trowel's point, clearing grit so the lid would move without grinding. He could feel a quiet pressure under his ribs, a doubled beat, the body's way of saying yes and be careful in the same stroke. He set the tools aside and wiped his gloves on his pants. He slid his fingers under the lip he had made. The cold touched his skin through the glove's fabric. He lifted. The lid objected, then complained, then grudgingly rose a fraction. A smell climbed out, old iron, wet paper, a faint mineral sourness that had no place above ground. He let the lid rest and repositioned his hands. Another lift. The hinges creaked in a tired hinge language that says, "We will, but don't rush us." The lid opened enough that light began to pour into the dark interior in a thin beam, drawing a pale rectangle on whatever lay inside. Harold did not look yet. He concentrated on the mechanics. Open a little, stop, adjust, open again, until the lid reached the limit of the hinges' patience and held itself, cocked and unwilling to go farther. He waited a moment for the smell to thin. He blinked at the change in light within the pit, because even that small dark had been a kind of room, and he had been inside it with his focus. He took one long breath, lifted his chin, and finally looked down. He did not reach in. He did not touch anything. He only looked. His eyes adjusted by degrees, taking the measure of a shadowed interior that bore the color of long-kept things. Shapes resolved, edges grew honest, the surfaces within turned from suggestion to detail. He saw enough to know the weight of what he had uncovered. He saw enough for his breath to shorten in a way that had nothing to do with labor. He closed his hand around the lip of the box and steadied himself against the wall of the pit with the other. The ground felt very stable under his boots, as if the yard had braced itself to share the moment. He was aware of his heartbeat against the soft interior of his throat, of the way the air had cooled around him despite the day's slow warmth. He did not say a word. There was nothing a word could add. Instead, he checked the edges a final time, as if to learn the last of the box's perimeter by touch. He pressed the lid's angle to be sure it would hold without slamming shut. He slid the trowel gently into the pit where it rested, gleaming faintly along the curve of its blade. He stepped back from the rim and looked at the whole of what he had done. A clean excavation, a box brought to light, a question finally forced into the open. The mound, that patient rise that had kept its counsel for nearly a decade, was no longer a shape. It was a container. The air seemed to shift around that knowledge, making space for it. Harold climbed from the pit and stood for a moment, hands on his hips, head slightly bowed. Sweat traced narrow lines down his temples and gathered at his jaw. He drew the back of his glove across his face and tasted salt. The yard hummed with quiet summer industry. Somewhere, a lawnmower coughed to life, sputtered, and steadied. A dog 2 houses over barked once, then decided against a second time. The world continued, indifferent but intact. He returned to the edge and looked down again. No second thoughts came. The work had been deliberate, the outcome inevitable once the first slice of sod had been lifted. He lowered himself into the pit, dropped to his knees in the narrow space, and angled his shoulders so he could peer farther into the box. He did not disturb anything. He simply allowed his eyes to gather what they could. Satisfaction did not arrive, nor triumph. What rose in him felt older, the emotion that comes when a long suspicion stands at attention and refuses to sit. He understood, with the practical clarity of a man who has worked his entire life with things that can kick or bite or break, that this was not a curiosity to be puzzled over. It was an answer, and answers often come with instructions. He exhaled slowly and closed the lid part way, carefully, respectfully, until a thin band of light remained at the seam. He left it like that, not sealed, not open, the way a book sometimes waits on a table for the next pair of hands. He climbed out, dusted the soil from his knees, and set the tools in an orderly line again, as if the arrangement could calm the day. In the churned earth at his feet, the shape of the box made a new kind of shadow, sharper, defined by edges instead of guesses. The mound was gone. In its place, a rusted rectangle that had chosen, finally, to show its face. Harold stood very still and let the quiet return around him. The air touched the back of his neck. His breath found its proper pace. He looked once more at the box and knew, deep in the steady center that had made him rise before dawn for half a century, that whatever he did next had to be done with care. The morning that began with a simple decision had delivered him to a threshold. He had crossed it. The ground had opened. The truth had taken a shape he could see and measure. He gathered his tools one by one and stepped back from the pit without turning his back on it, the way a man steps away from a live wire or the lip of a deep well. When he finally did turn, he did so slowly, as if leaving a room where someone still slept. The lid remained ajar. The light held. The air, faintly metallic now, moved in a thin current along the grass. Harold walked to the shed, laid the shovel against the wall, and reached for the cup on the stoop. The coffee had gone cold. He took a breath instead. He let it fill the spaces that work had emptied, then set the cup down again. He looked back once more, not to check, not to count, but because the act of looking felt like part of the work. Then he nodded to no one and to nothing in particular. He had done what he came out to do. He had found not a rock, but a box, not a quirk of soil, but a purpose. And now, with the lid waiting where he had left it, with the rectangle nested in its careful bed of air, the day turned its face toward what would follow. Harold Wilson stood at the edge of the pit, staring into the half-opened box, his breath uneven and his palms damp inside his gloves. For years he had imagined explanations for the mound, a tangle of roots, a forgotten septic pipe, even the strange idea of some buried animal nest. None of those possibilities prepared him for what his eyes now traced inside the rusted container. The box was no simple chest of tools or scraps of metal. Neatly stacked within were objects that bore the unmistakable profile of ammunition rounds. Their brass casings were dull with age, but the shapes were unmistakable. Long cylinders of purpose, lined up with unsettling precision. Alongside them rested smaller, squared blocks wrapped in deteriorating waxed paper. Even through the discoloration and decay, Harold could see the faint stenciled letters, "Explosive." His stomach clenched. His blood turned cold. A sound left his mouth, somewhere between a gasp and a curse. He stumbled back from the pit, his boots scraping against the uneven soil. The air around him felt suddenly heavier, charged with the knowledge that one wrong movement might end not only his morning, but his very life. The truth of the mound crystallized with terrifying clarity. It had been hiding a cache of live military ordnance beneath his shed for decades. Harold's hands shook as he pulled the phone from his pocket. His thumb nearly missed the numbers, but he pressed them anyway. 911. The ringing felt longer than it was. When the operator's voice answered, calm and professional, the words poured out of Harold in a trembling rush. "There are explosives. In my backyard. A box. I dug into it. It's full of ammunition, maybe bombs. Please, send someone. Now." The operator kept her voice steady, asking for his address, his name, whether he was safe, whether he could step away from the area. Harold gave short, clipped answers. He couldn't take his eyes off the pit. It seemed alive, the box within it a coiled threat, silent but potent. Within minutes, sirens pierced the suburban calm. The wail grew louder, closer, until the street outside Harold's house erupted with flashing red and blue. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains and stepped out onto porches, confusion painted across their faces. They saw the police cruisers slide to a stop, officers jumping out to cordon off the area. Then came the heavy black van of the bomb squad, its doors swinging open as figures in protective gear spilled out, moving with swift, practiced precision. "Sir, please step back," one officer called as he approached Harold's yard. Another began stretching bright yellow tape across the property line. Harold obeyed, retreating toward his porch, though his eyes stayed locked on the pit. He felt both exposed and strangely small, a man who had lived 75 years only to find himself standing a few steps away from death buried in his garden. The bomb technicians advanced carefully toward the mound. Their protective suits glinted under the sun, their movements deliberate, rehearsed. One knelt at the edge, peering into the box with the caution of someone gazing into the jaws of a predator. Another barked quiet commands over a radio, summoning equipment from the van. Padded cases, insulated tools, a robotic arm mounted on tracks. Harold's neighbors had gathered now, forming uneasy clusters behind the police tape. Mothers pulled their children closer. Retired men in baseball caps whispered theories in low voices. Some held up their phones, recording shaky videos that would soon flood local news stations and social media. "Explosives found in backyard," the captions would say. "Suburban street locked down." The technicians lowered the robotic arm into the pit, and claw carefully gripping one of the smaller blocks wrapped in faded paper. The moment it lifted, the entire crowd seemed to hold its breath. The block was placed gently into a bomb-proof container. Then another and another, each one secured with the same methodical care. The ammunition rounds followed, their dull surfaces glinting in the afternoon light as though reluctant to leave their resting place. Harold watched, his pulse hammering. The process felt endless, every second stretched thin with the possibility of disaster. Yet the technicians moved without hesitation, their expertise the only thing standing between the neighborhood and catastrophe. Finally, the lead technician straightened, gave a curt nod, and signaled to the officers. The pit was empty. The box had surrendered its deadly cargo. The ordnance was sealed away in armored cases, ready to be transported for safe disposal. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd. Mothers loosened their grip on their children. Men lowered their phones. Police officers relaxed their stances, though their eyes still darted around, ensuring no threat remained. The flashing lights still painted the street in urgent color, but the immediate danger had passed. Harold stood apart, shoulders heavy, watching as the box that had haunted him for a decade was finally lifted out. He felt relief, yes, but also something deeper, an unease that what had been unearthed was larger than his yard alone. This was no ordinary find. It was a relic of a war fought long before his neighbors had even been born, lying silent under suburban grass until he had decided one morning that he could no longer ignore it. The bomb squad packed up their gear, their armored van rumbling to life. Police officers moved from house to house, reassuring neighbors that the situation was under control. Reporters were already arriving, microphones in hand, eager to turn Harold's quiet street into the stage for tonight's broadcast. But Harold heard none of it clearly. His mind replayed the moment his shovel had struck the box, the hollow ring of metal against earth, the tremor that had traveled up his arms. That sound would never leave him. It was the moment when his retirement shifted from quiet routine to something else entirely, a discovery that pulled the past into the present with terrifying force. As the vehicles departed and the crowd thinned, Harold sat on the porch steps, staring at the now empty pit. The soil was disturbed, but the true disturbance was inside him. He had lived alongside death for years, oblivious to the danger just feet from where he drank his morning coffee. And though the explosives were gone, the weight of what he had unearthed pressed heavier on him than the soil ever had. What had seemed like an ordinary suburban backyard had just revealed itself as the stage of a secret that could have destroyed lives. And Harold could not shake the feeling that the story of the mound was far from over. The following morning, the pit beside Harold Wilson's shed lay silent, a hollow scar of upturned soil. The box was gone, the explosives carted away under flashing lights and heavy precautions. But the unease remained, thick as the dew that clung to the grass. Harold rose early, though he had hardly slept. His coffee cooled untouched on the porch rail while he stared at the empty space that had ruled his thoughts for nearly a decade. It wasn't long before investigators returned. 2 police cruisers rolled up quietly, followed by an unmarked sedan. Men in plain clothes stepped out carrying clipboards and folders. One of them, younger but with tired eyes, introduced himself as Detective Harris. His voice was calm, steady, as though meant to reassure not only Harold but the whole neighborhood. "Mr. Wilson," he said, "we're following up on the discovery yesterday. We've traced some of the property records, and it looks like the man who owned this home before you was a World War II veteran, a decorated soldier. From what we can tell, he may have buried those munitions himself." Harold blinked, his hand tightening on the railing. A veteran. A man who had walked through battlefields oceans away, only to return and place pieces of that war into the quiet soil of his backyard. The thought unsettled him. These were not keepsakes. These were not medals or photographs tucked away in a trunk. These were weapons, dangerous remnants of a time when death was carried in crates and delivered without hesitation. Detective Harris continued, explaining how veterans sometimes brought back items as souvenirs, tokens of a war they could not fully leave behind. Ammunition, explosives, knives, helmets, objects meant to anchor memory but often too dangerous to keep. Over the decades, most families discarded them or turned them over to authorities. But others remained, forgotten or hidden, until time or circumstance forced them into view. In Harold's yard, the earth itself had done the forcing. Groundwater and shifting soil had slowly pushed the buried box upward, inch by inch, until it created the mound that consumed Harold's peace for 10 long years. The neighbors gathered again as word spread. They spoke in hushed voices, their curiosity edged with fear. "What if it had gone off?" one woman whispered, clutching her child's shoulder. "We've been living next to a bomb." Another neighbor shook his head. "Makes you wonder how many more of these are still out there." Phones lifted again, recording Harold's modest home, the empty pit, the officials taking notes. For Harold, their whispers faded into background noise. He stood at the edge of the pit, his gaze fixed on the earth, imagining the veteran who once lived here lowering that box into the ground. What had driven him? Fear? Guilt? A need to hide something too terrible to keep in plain sight? Harold's mind offered no clear answer, only questions that circled tighter and tighter. By late afternoon, the investigators left, their notes gathered, their conclusions pending in official reports. News vans arrived in their place, parking along the street. Reporters adjusted microphones, speaking of an extraordinary discovery in a suburban neighborhood, and a 75-year-old man whose backyard unearthed a relic of war. Cameras angled toward Harold, who gave no interviews, shaking his head each time a microphone edged too close. He wasn't interested in headlines. He was interested in silence. When evening came, Harold sat again on his porch, the neighborhood quieter now, though not at ease. He looked at the darkened shape of the shed, at the flattened grass around the pit. Relief flickered inside him, relief that the danger was gone, that the box no longer lay beneath his feet. But the relief did not last. In its place rose a heavier awareness. For nearly a decade he had lived beside a hidden grave of violence. A box of war buried under his tomatoes and beans, under the laughter of passing children, under the stillness of his quiet life. The box was gone, yet the questions remained. How many other yards across America hid similar secrets? How many families lived unaware, their lives resting above shadows of conflict carried home from foreign battlefields? Harold could not know. What he did know was this: the mound had been more than a curiosity. It had been a warning. As the sun sank and the streetlights buzzed awake, Harold leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. The war he had never fought had found its way into his backyard. The earth had carried it upward, year after year, until it could no longer be ignored. And in uncovering it, Harold had realized something deeper, that history never truly disappears. It waits. It hides. And sometimes it rises to the surface, demanding to be seen. The night air cooled, wrapping itself around him. Harold closed his eyes, hearing only the hum of crickets, the soft rustle of leaves. But beneath it all lingered the hollow ring of shovel against metal, the sound that had changed his life forever. And with that memory came the thought that unsettled him most of all. If a single suburban backyard could conceal such danger, what else might still lie buried beneath the calm face of ordinary America? Unbelievable, right? What would you do in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe so you never miss the next shocking story.